Hello, darlings. Moon here, and the haunting hour is nearly upon us. Do you dare to take an adventure with me through the graveyard where magic awaits to bring another doll to life? Well, let's get into it, but only if you dare. Our journey starts with this nightmare of a Monster High Frankie doll who will become Miss Jacq-o-Leen, the Pumpkinhead Queen. Before I can work my magic on her, I need to give her a factory reset. First, it's off with her head and then scraping out her gooey hairy minds, just like a real pumpkin. And now it's time to remove her face. Much better, darlings. To make this head into a pumpkin head, I plan to sculpt right onto her head. Alas, doll heads are too squishy naturally to sculpt directly onto, but I learned that if you shrink the head, they harden up. To do that, I mixed water and acid together and had the head soak for 2 days in the doll soup, and the results of our little science project. I sanded out the neck opening so it could fit back onto the net peg, and I also drilled out her eyes and carved out her mouth and cut open her head. I also trimmed down the neck peg so the head could fit back onto the body and so you wouldn't see it from the outside looking in. Looking creepy. Perfect. Now it's time to use epoxy sculpt to give her her pumpkin head. To do that, I added rolled pieces of epoxy sculpt to head to build up the ridges of the pumpkin. I carve away at the epoxy sculpt with my knife to give her big jack-o'-lantern smile. And of course, jack-o'-lanterns got to have eyes as well. Jacq-o'-Leen, the Pumpkinhead Queen, is inspired by a painting I did last Halloween. I've got a video up on my channel that shows the whole process. Check it out if you don't want Jacq-o'-Leen to haunt you in the night. Finally, some teeth to finish off the front of her face. Once the front was cured, I followed the same process to build out the back of the pumpkin head. I added some vine tendrils at her neckline. To make the top of the pumpkin head, I covered the cure head in saran wrap and then sculpted the top on top of that. Once the head was finished curing, I could start painting her pumpkin orange. After an obscene number of coats, oh my gosh, this took so many coats, you don't have any idea. I think I did almost like 20 or 30 coats, like I lost a count, but nonetheless, once she was finally orange enough to my liking, I can move on to blushing her with some chalk pastels. Once all the base colors were down, I give her a good coat of Mr. Super Clear so I can use the pastels to shade her and start building up that depth. I started with a deep orange red and then progressed to a darker brown, really focusing on the ridges and the crevices to build up the shadows of her face. And then I moved on to highlighting with a yellow and then sealed all that in. Next, using a watered down black and brown acrylic mix, I go over some of the darker recessed areas to really make them pronounced, and also use a yellow watercolor pencil over some of the edges to make those pop as well. I also drag the pencil across the skin to make it look a little bit more like pumpkin skin. The final step was to paint the inside of the head black. And with that, her pumpkin head is complete. On to body modification. The first step was to cut away her bolts and to sand off her stitch tattoos. Looking all clean, but we're not done yet. Next, I cut off her leg. Well, we don't need that anymore. And for our second doll sacrifice of the night, the 𝐋𝐢𝐯𝐶 is going to donate some of her limbs. I hold the bone leg in place with a little hot glue and some epoxy sculpt to make it permanent. Will I have a complete body? For now, I want Jacq-o-Leen to have the appearance of being corseted. The first step in that process was to sand down the existing chest line. Next, I wanted to pinch the waist, and I tried a heat cut at first, but that didn't work, and I actually ended up boiling her in some water instead. The elastic I tied around her waist pinched it, but did end up leaving some marks, which I then had to sand away. Much better, darlings. Epoxy sculpt makes another appearance to help build out the new corseted chest line. And to build out her hips to give her more of a corseted hourglass look. I also felt like she needed a real little rebalancing in the booty, so I gave her a little bit of a bigger butt as well. I wanted Jacq-o-Leen's pumpkin head to glow like a real jack-o'-lantern, but in order for me to run the wiring through her body, I had to cut off her head and cut her at her waist and drill out her insides. Once that was completed, I could feed the LED safely and easily through her body. Good old epoxy sculpt comes in to give her a hand in pulling herself back together. Now that the doll is back in one piece again, I have a little sanding I need to do. And she's starting to look normal-ish again. Next, I decided that her corset needed a little something, and I added a ruffle at the bottom with some epoxy sculpt. Body modifications are finally complete, and now it's time for paint. First step was getting her deathly complexion a little bit more cohesive. Then after a coat of Mr. Super Clear, I used my chalk pastels to blush her body. Next step was to lay down the base colors for the corset. And then I used some chalk pastels to do some basic shading. Earlier, I had tried to sculpt some boning channels directly onto the body, but it was just too fussy to accomplish. So I opted to draw on the boning channels instead using a watercolor pencil. Once I was happy with the design, I used the chalk pastels again to add depth to the panels of the corset. I also drew some lace designs on the cut portions of the corset for some added detail. Final step in painting the corset was to add painted highlights to the ruffle. And with the body complete, it's on to her outfit, darlings. As someone with a costuming background, I was thrilled to create Jacq-o-Leen's dress, her corseted pinstripe gown with its big puffy sleeves and long skirt. I was inspired by costumes from Crimson Peak and Sleepy Hollow, so I explored the eras of those films set in 1901 and 1799 respectively for my ideas. My first design leaned into the turn-of-the-century style, but I just didn't feel quite right. For my second design, I drew from different trends of the 1880s, like the dome-shaped skirts of the 1860s and the exaggerated sleeves of the 1890s, balancing those round shapes with her pumpkin head. I also planned to reveal her bone leg through a cutaway in the dress with the hoop skirt underneath. With the finalized design, I was able to get to work patterning. I used the tape method to draft the bodice of the dress and transfer it to paper. The skirt pattern took a bit more effort, but 6 mock-ups later, I finally had something I liked. With patterns finalized, it's on to dyeing fabric. I chose a white cotton fabric for the dress because it's easily dyeable. I tried a few different methods of dyeing the fabric, and I settled on dyeing the fabric with black tea. After 15 minutes in the biggest cup of tea I ever made, the fabric was ready to transfer my patterns to. Next, I used a marker to pinstripe the fabric for the dress. With all the fabric preparations complete, I could actually get to sewing the dress now, adding some lace details to parts of the bodice for extra interest. I used a spider fishnet to finish off the sleeves. Next, I gathered the skirt portion and gathered it up. I then attached the bodice to the skirt. It was at this point I abandoned the idea of tearing the dress to expose the bone leg because the dress was turning out too cute to ruin, so I added some lace and beading and bows to the hem. To give my dress that extra pumpkin poof, I made a petticoat out of tulle netting and attached it to the rest of the dress. To support our big poofy skirt, I needed to make a hoop skirt, and after some number crunching, I decided to use weed eater line to create the hoops. I made the casings out of hem tape, and then fed the line through them and sewed the ends together. I sewed a harness out of ribbon to hold the hoops in place. And then detailed it with some bows and lace. With the hoop skirt complete, her ensemble is almost finished. Now for some footwear. I already had these booties in my doll shoe drawer, and I got to work repainting them. I started with a cream-colored base. Then it added a black-brown mix to the select parts of the boot. I added a wash to age the cream portions of the shoes. And added some bronze metallic paint to the lace eyelets. Next, I added a gloss varnish to the dark parts of the shoe and traced over the laces in white acrylic. Finishing touch was adding a bow to the front of the boot. For the bone leg, it wasn't as simple as repainting a pre-existing shoe. I drilled into her foot to attach this shaped wire to create a vine high heel, if you will. Using epoxy sculpt, I covered the wire heel and then continued the vine up her leg. Once it was cured, I painted it with acrylics and shaded the bone leg with some chalk pastels. Jacq-o-Leen is almost ready to haunt the night, but she has one more accessory that I need to finish. Her skull-shaped candy bowl. I made the skull out of an epoxy sculpt and then painted it in acrylics and chalk pastels, gradually getting darker with every layer of pastels. To make the candies in her bowl, I made them out of polymer clay and made shapes like candy corns, lollipops, and a candied pumpkin. I arranged the candies in her dish, holding them in place with some hot glue. After a slight interruption, I had one last thing to finish on Jacq-o-Leen, and that was to finish wiring the lights. And we are glowing, and as I was getting ready to set the lights in place, tragedy struck.
What happened? Why did one go out? No. Why? They were both just working. What happened? Oh, I know what happened. The wiring broke on the back of the doll, coming out of the base of the doll. It just fatigued and it broke. There's literally nothing I can do to fix this. The part that's broken is inside the doll.
It was a little embarrassing to have this happen live on stream, but luckily chat understood my disappointment and were really supportive of me. Thank you, chat, for being there, because I think I would have lost my mind if you weren't. But in the end, I decided that one light is better than no light and just decided to proceed with final looks and take it as a hard lesson when working with electronics. But without further ado, here is Miss Jacq-o-Leen. Miss Jacq-o-Leen, the Pumpkinhead Queen, as she's half pumpkin, half dead human being. It happened, you see, on All Hallows Eve, when a pumpkin, a magical one, I believe, rolled into a graveyard and smashed upon the grave of one Miss Jacq-o-Leen, died 1893. The gourd cracked open, spilling its seed. They scattered hither and thro, but one went down to the grave below, you see. The magical seed took root with ease. The vines grew quickly, entwining the limbs of our dear Jacq-o-Leen further and further into her skull until they grew a pumpkin hole. To life she sprung, bursting with ease through her coffin that fateful Hallows Eve. Now be careful where you roam on Halloween night, as Miss Jacq-o-Leen, the pumpkin-headed queen, will play tricks or treats on you to her delight. Thank you for watching today's video. Please make sure you like and subscribe, and if you don't, I'll haunt you in your sleep. Just kidding. Maybe. Till next time, darlings. And I hope you have a haunting Halloween.